Now that we have a full character creation screen, we're going to modify the player object to hold a list of player attributes instead of the hard-coded dexterity property we had. And we're going to change the rest of the program to deal with the changes for the new player class. We are going to comment out some of the classes because we already are changing 14 files in this lesson, and I don't want to have this too long. And I'm also going to remove the class property from the player, like a fighter, magic user, cleric, something that I just didn't really feel like using, and it's a little bit extra complexity that we don't need, so I'm just going to clear that out. We'll start by opening the solution and modifying some of the test classes in the test engine project. First we'll do test combat service, and we're going to comment out the test on lines 13 through 17, because this kind of needs the old player constructor with just the dexterity and not the player attributes. We'll fix this in the next lesson. We'll do the same type of thing in the test save game service, where we test the save and load game, again because we're changing the dexterity to player attributes. So we'll comment out all the lines inside the test restore 01000 function, and we'll modify test game session. We'll comment out the code in the test create game session, and the test player moves home and is completely healed on killed. Next we'll go into the engine project and modify the save game service. The load last save or create new function, we'll just comment the whole function out because we're not going to use it after this lesson. And the create player function, for right now we'll comment out lines 50 through 75 and add a return null. And we'll come back in the next lesson to clean these up to use the new player object format. Now to get to the main point of the lesson, we'll go into engine models living entity, and we're going to change this to use the new player attributes. On line 3 we need to add a using directive for system collection object model, since we're going to add this observable collection, and of course that's the next thing we need to do. On lines 22 and 23 we have this new attributes property, which is an observable collection of player attributes, and we can delete the old dexterity property and the old underscore dexterity backing variable that it had. Then we need to go down to the constructor on line 148, and before we used to have a parameter for the living entity that took in an integer for the dexterity. Now we need an IEnumerable, a list basically of player attributes, and we're going to pass those in instead. And inside our constructor, we'll get rid of the old line where we assign the dexterity parameter to the dexterity property, and instead we're going to replace it with this for each loop that will go through each of our attributes we passed in and add them to the attributes observable collection property, this new one we just added. And that should be all we need to do for the living entity class. Then we'll go into the monster class, and we can remove the using directive for system collections object model that was on line 2, and we're going to modify the monster constructor to take in an IEnumerable of player attribute for the attributes and to pass that into the base constructor. And then we need to do the same type of thing on our get new instance. When we clone the monster, we need to make sure that we're passing in the attributes here for the new monster instead of the dexterity. Then we can go into the player class and do the same type of thing. First you can delete the character class property and its backing variable underscore character class, since I'm not using that any longer. And then we need to go down to the constructor and do the same type of thing. The constructor needs to take in an IEnumerable of player attributes and pass that into the living entity constructor. And since the class is being removed, we can get rid of the old class variable that was being passed in on the player constructor and the line that used to assign it to the character class property. Next we'll go into the trader class and do the same type of thing. Here we used to pass in a hard-coded dexterity. It doesn't really matter for the trader since the trader can't take place in combat. So now we're just going to pass in a new list of player attributes so that at least the structure works. The base constructor is living entity, so it needs to have a list of player attributes, and we'll just pass in an empty list. To make things a little easier, we're going to modify engine shared extension methods, and we're going to add this new extension method on lines 43 through 48, get attribute. It's an extension method for living entities, so this would be player, monsters, and traders if we want to include them. And we pass in the attribute key. This is going to be DEX for dexterity, STR for strength, or whatever you use for your game data. And this is going to say just on the entity, look in the attributes list, find the first one where the key matches and ignore the case, and then return that attribute. Since we modified the monster class, we need to go into Engine Factory's Monster Factory and modify the Monster Factory, since this is what instantiates monster objects, and we have a new constructor. On line 7, I added the using directive for engine services because now we want to pull in the game data. Since monsters now have attributes, we need to know what the attributes are, and that information is in the game data. So what we'll do next is on line 16, add a new variable to hold the game details, and then inside the static constructor, we are going to, on line 23, populate that from the game details XML file. This way we'll have a list of the attributes that we need to add for the monster. Then we go down to lines 49 through 54 in the load monsters from nodes, where we get the player attributes from the game details, and we find the one that's dexterity, and we get the value from the XML, the node single select dexterity, and we assign that to the base value of that first attribute with dexterity and to the modified value. In the future, we can possibly go into the monsters data file and do some dice notations so the monsters have random strength or dexterity. But for now, we're just going to go with the old hard-coded dexterity value from the data file. And then we're going to take this attributes variable, most of them which are kind of unassigned for the base value and modified value, except for dexterity, and we'll pass that into the monster constructor, where we used to pass in dexterity. Now we're passing in a list of player attributes. Next, we'll go into Engine Services Combat Service and change all of our instances where we used to say player.dexterity or opponent.dexterity, and we're going to use our new extension method, get attribute, getting the dexterity attribute, and getting the modified value. We need to do that here in the first attacker to figure out who attacks first, and then we need to do it down here on lines 36 through 39 for the attack succeeded function. Now we're going to go into Engine View Models Character Creation View Model, and we're going to create a full player object here. So on line 3, we need to add in the using engine factories, since we're going to get the default items and we need the item factory for this. And then down on the get player function in line 73, now when we instantiate a player, we're going to pass in the player attributes from the screen, and we're going to add these default items and recipes. So now after character creation view model, when the player clicks OK to go ahead and use the character that they see, we'll instantiate the player object with those attributes, give them the default value, and this is the player object we'll pass into the game. So we need to go into game session now, and we'll get rid of the constructor that used to assign those default items, and now we'll just use the new constructor that we added recently that takes in the fully populated player object. And just to clean things up, I also went in and deleted the extra using directives that we don't need any longer. There was one on line 1 and one on line 7. It was for system.io and newtonsoft.json.link. Now that the backend is all cleaned up, we can go into the UI. So go to WPF UI mainwindow.xaml.cs. We used to have two constructors here, one that took in a player object and one that didn't. Now we're just going to merge it so we have one constructor that takes in a player object, initializes the components, initializes the user input actions, and then sets the game session to a new game session with the passed in player. And we have some code in here to handle the menu options for saving and loading. So we need to go down to line 142 in the start new game and comment this out, the set active game session 2. In our load game function, we need to comment all those lines out. And then in the save game function, We just need to comment out line 194 so it doesn't try to save the game. We're going to disable these menu options in the UI in a second, but this is just to be safe and so that we can compile and not need to worry about the saving and load game not matching the new format. So in the UI, I changed a lot in the player stats that starts on line 60. The first thing I did is I deleted the labels for the character class and the character class value and the dexterity in the value. Then I moved everything that was below it, all the grid row up by two rows since we deleted those 2 rows. Then on lines 87 through 114, we have a Listbox control to show the player attribute and the values. This isn't exactly the prettiest XAML, and this is kind of an indicator that maybe it's time to start working on the UI. I know we need to do the save and load game feature next with the new player class structure, and I'm thinking after that we either clean up the UI or possibly convert to .NET 5. Have to decide that, and if you have any thoughts on that, please leave a comment. But for now, we have this player attribute list box that's going to act kind of like a data grid, but it doesn't look as much like a spreadsheet as a data grid would. The important things are to notice, so our listbox source, the item source is the current player attributes, and I have grid is shared size scope equals true. This is what I had to do to get it so that all of the descriptions line up properly and all of the values of the player attributes line up properly. And that's what this listbox item template is. We set up a data template for each attribute, and it's a horizontal stack panel, so it's kind of like a left box and a right box to hold the data. We put in a grid here, and we say the column definition shared size group is description. So everything here, every text block where we display the name of the player attribute is going to have the same size because they're all in the description size group. And then here on lines 104 to 110, we do the same thing. We have a grid, and the shared size group is modified value, and this is for the modified value of the player attribute, but this makes sure that they're all the same size. Really the important thing is the description, because that way they'll all be as wide as the widest one. You'll see when we play the game in the UI, which is what we will do now. I'm going to put in a name here, select elf, use the player, and now we have the name. And here is our list box showing the strength, intelligence, wisdom, all that. And notice how the values here are pretty much lined up. If we didn't do that shared size group, then the 10 here for the strength would be like right after the 10, and the 10 for the intelligence would be right after intelligence, and this wouldn't look as clean. This definitely isn't perfect, but for right now, until we start working on the UI a little bit, I think it's good enough to work with. As I mentioned, the next lesson will be to fix the save and load game, and after that, I need to decide, is it time to convert this to .NET 5? And I'd kind of like your input. If you want to make it so you can run this game on Linux and Macs, then .NET 5 is really the way to do it, or at least .NET Core 3.1. And it's probably easier to do it now than to do it later, because there's not a smooth, it's not just click a couple buttons and now it's .NET 5. And then I think after that, we want to start looking at the UI, because this is kind of an ugly UI, and it would be nice to make the game look a little bit neater, a little cleaner, a little bit more fun to play. So let me know your thoughts on that. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave a comment below the video or on the page with the source code. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next lesson.